The Imperative of American Leadership by Joshua Muravchik. I think I'm pronouncing that right. So this is one of my scripted book reviews where I kind of go through the archives, kind of old stuff I'd written on the blog or for university, make it into a YouTube video. This is a book report from university. So it's a political science class I took. I took this class in 2000. The book was written 4 years before that. So the book was written in 1996 by Joshua Muravchik. Probably nobody remembers it now. You know, these kind of political books have a very short shelf life. In the book, Muravchik was kind of a, he's a right-winger. He's a polemical writer. He's writing that, America kind of needs to step up and lead the world and kind of solve the world's conflicts. He's a right-winger, but there was kind of a split at that time in the Republican Party between kind of interventionist Republicans like, George Bush, and isolationist Republicans like Pat Buchanan. So the book is kind of somewhat, as best I can remember actually, a shot against the isolationist Republicans and also kind of against a lot of the assumptions in there I think are against kind of the more leftists as well. The thrust of the book is that, America needs to become the world leader and kind of get involved in all these world conflicts. It's a polemical book, and I think the reason our professor gave us such an extreme polemical book is to kind of provoke some reactions against it. Like, this is one extreme, this is the other extreme, now you kind of critique it and stuff like that. So I think we were encouraged to kind of critique it, and I did. I was not subtle in this at all. I was not subtle in general about my political opinions at that age. I was, considered myself a leftist at that time. Well, still do. Was also a pacifist and considered myself a Christian pacifist. So I kind of critiqued the book from that angle, bringing in kind of all the stuff that I thought about, like American foreign policy. This is going to be a little bit dated because it refers to political events both when Muravchik wrote the book in 1996 and when I was critiquing it in 2000. So, fair warning. Anyways, in his book, The Imperative of American Leadership, Joshua Muravchik discusses the phenomenon of neo-isolationism. Muravchik argues against what he identifies as the tendency of the United States to shy away from taking a strong leadership role. Muravchik cites the example in Yugoslavia as a case study of how neither Europe nor the United States was able to exert strong leadership in a time of crisis. Able or willing, I think, was his thesis. We could have done it, but we weren't willing. His conclusion is a unilateral leadership role that the United States should assume. Boy, that's an awkward sentence. Should say his conclusion is that the United States should assume a unilateral leadership role. I found reading Joshua Muravchik to be an interesting experience. One thought that frequently reoccurred to me as I was reading this book was, how could a man who knows so much be so stupid? Muravchik continually amazed me with his logical gaps and his outrageous statements. My personal favorite was, quote on 208 of the book, he said, "We entered World War II late and won it. We entered the Cold War late and won it." Now, this is wrong on both accounts. First of all, we did not win World War II, at least we didn't in Europe. Hitler's armies were already in retreat when we landed in Normandy. It was the Soviet Union that turned Germany back. But then secondly, what does he mean by we entered the Cold War late? Like, how could the Cold War even exist before we entered it? There was no Cold War without, you have to have two sides to have a Cold War. Stupid. So, in order to refute all of Muravchik's logical shortcomings, it would require almost a page-by-page analysis. So instead, I'm just going to focus on 3 general assumptions that he bases his book on. And these are what I primarily objected to. To begin with, I should say that I consider myself a Christian pacifist. I don't believe that military intervention is an acceptable Christian alternative in any situation. Now, I realize this is not considered mainstream politics, so I don't expect Muravchik to agree with this. But what I resent is that he completely ignores the distinction between pacifism and isolationism. He's just all too eager to assume that pacifists are all in the same category as Pat Buchanan and don't care about the rest of the world. I am a pacifist, but like Muravchik, I believe America has a responsibility to help the rest of the world. And like Muravchik, I believe that all life is sacred, not just that of American citizens. However, I don't believe that dropping bombs and sending troops is going to solve anything. And it is unfair of Muravchik to then assume that I am an isolationist because I don't want to invade other countries and assume that I don't care about the rest of the world. Muravchik doesn't even address the pacifist alternative. He just has isolationism and interventionism. There is a second problem I have with Muravchik. At one point in the book, he uses an analogy of global politics as hawks preying on the weaker birds. Muravchik asserts that the American leadership is needed to stop the hawks. This is the assumption throughout the book. But Muravchik gives no thought to the idea that the United States might well be the hawk. Muravchik cites the example of Iraq as a positive example of United States foreign policy. The idea that we stopped Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1992. But not mentioned in his book is the devastation that the Gulf War and the following economic sanctions have caused the Iraqi people. Muravchik does not even consider this. Although, to be fair, this book was written in 1996. I think the debate about the Iraqi sanctions wasn't as prominent then as it was in 2000 when I was reviewing this book. I think the issue increased in prominence. Worse, Muravchik cites Reagan's policy in Nicaragua as yet another positive example of American influence abroad. Now, personally, I believe what Reagan did to Nicaragua was awful. And again, I realize this is a matter of debate. You know, the right wing believes one thing about Nicaragua, the left wing believes another thing about Nicaragua. So I don't expect Muravchik to agree with me. But when Muravchik talks about the example in Nicaragua, he talks about it as if there's no debate, as if everybody knows that what Reagan did in Nicaragua was a positive. So in doing this, I think Muravchik loses much of his credibility, and it shows what a narrow perspective, a narrow ideological perspective he has on world events. While I'm on the subject, last semester, for a different class, I had to read another Muravchik book, which is called Media Coverage of the Sandinista Revolution. That's how I'm somewhat familiar with him and know his kind of reputation as a right-winger. I found that book just as equally ridiculous as well. Now, when Muravchik is talking about American foreign policy, you can argue with him on Nicaragua and Iraq, but what's really telling is all the examples that he doesn't bring up. So, for example, Guatemala in the 1950s, where the U.S., the CIA overthrew the government there. Or Argentina in the 1970s. Or El Salvador during the 1980s. Or current at the time, maybe it's still current, the United States funding the Colombian military in spite of all the human rights disasters going on there at the time. And the School of the Americas. And then just a general exploitation of third world countries by American corporations. He doesn't mention any of this, but if you look at that, then you can say, well, the United States is not the protector of the world. The United States is the hawk. It's not thing protecting the world from the hawks. And then there's Muravchik's discussion on world trade. Now, as with the Iraq example, I think you can give him a little bit of slack on this, because he wrote the book in 1996, and the debates about the World Trade Organization, at least some media coverage of these debates, didn't really kind of start to take off until about 1999, 2000, at least in my memory. Correct me if I'm wrong. So for a book in 1996, you can cut him some slack. But nonetheless, he's kind of basing his arguments off of these assumptions, which are not shared. So he's kind of assuming something, which he really shouldn't be assuming. He should be proving this to his readers. I was at one of the IMF protests. This was April of 2000. And I saw a sign. The sign said, "Hey bankers, your profits are being made with the bodies of third world women." A powerful sign. I probably shouldn't have cited that sign in a university paper. I don't know what I was thinking. That's not like a credible source. It's just a sign somebody made. Anyways, I'd just say, although this sign is an obvious oversimplification of the problems surrounding globalization, it brings up a point completely absent from Muravchik's discussion. Muravchik says that the less developed countries do not want to slow their ascent from poverty for the sake of the environment. Who are we to stand in their way? But that's not really fair, because first of all, the welfare of the people who live in these third world countries is closely tied to the environment. You know, if you make it so that they can't breathe the air that they're living in, then that's not kind of improving their state of life. The other thing is that often when the GDP of these countries rises, it's only kind of benefiting the elite of these countries, and the poor people are suffering because the environment is getting worse. In fact, one could make the argument that the policies of the World Trade Organization is harmful to the great majority of third world workers. So perhaps America should use its influence to secure the rights of the third world people instead of just focusing on opening up the business markets. Although Muravchik obviously has plenty of data at his disposal when he's writing this book, it's obvious he is only looking at a narrow set of examples and data sets. Muravchik sees the world through patriotic lenses, but he does not realize that the world neither wants nor needs American leadership. Hopefully, others will find his ideas as ridiculous as I do. Yeah.